years, Connor Williams has served as the United States Congress as lead historian for its naming commission, researching the history, causes, and context of the Department of Defense assets commemorating Confederates or the Confederacy. He directed the commission's historical initiatives, collaborated with other historians, and engaged with both the general public and specific stakeholders. This work culminated with directing the writing, revising, and editing of the Naming Commission's final reports to Congress. Connor continues to serve through a gratuitous services agreement, answering questions about the Commission's work and advising defense entities on its decisions. Honored by the opportunity for national service, Connor Williams took a leave of absence from Yale, where he has taught at Yale University, Southern Connecticut State University, and for many of Yale's public history projects. He has also worked for Yale's Manuscripts and Archives Division and the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition. Connor earned his MA at Dartmouth College and is a PhD advanced candidate at Yale University. So without further ado, let's welcome Connor Williams.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you all for being here. It's lovely to see you. Just real quick, when I was listening to Kelly discuss the upcoming programs, my jaw was dropping like lower and lower and lower, because every one of those historians she's mentioned is just a top-notch, phenomenal Civil War scholar. So you have a lot of exciting talks coming after this one, and I hope this will be exciting also. I have a kind of strange disclaimer, but less strange here. One of the photos I'm going to show in my brief remarks features an amputation, or actually many amputations, so I just want people to be aware of that. I know that it's also in the museum. I hadn't planned this, but I was here in September and took a museum tour, and I had a sticker, and I stuck it on my water bottle, just kind of not even thinking, just slapped it on there. And 4 months later, it's still there, going strong. I've washed this a lot, but it's still there. So the American Civil War Museum, lasting memories and lasting stickers. Behind my slides. So I'm going to try to do a few things tonight, very briefly. I'm going to just for about 15-20 minutes tell the story of the Naming Commission, more what we did, and I would love for the questions to get asked about what you think about what we did, and questions you have about what we did, why we did it. So we start off just telling the story and speaking also to kind of these three big terms that have defined my life over the last 2 years, which are history, memory, and commemoration. And I think we often think of those things all the same, but they're really three different things. I also wanted to start, because it is Martin Luther King Jr. Weekend, or week, just with a brief kind of meditation. And I want to start at the most famous moment of Dr. King's career, the I Have a Dream speech. It is, some scholars like to say it's overdone. It's an incredibly inspiring speech. I read it for the 100th time to get ready for this talk, and once again, I was just ready to go out to my rural street and, yell, let freedom ring. But what people miss about that speech, especially as it's taught to our elementary school students, high school students, it's actually a Civil War speech. The I Have a Dream refrain starts at about minute 5 and page 4 of the speech. You have to remember, he's giving it on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. And he starts out, first words, in case you missed it, are 50 years ago. So he's taking the Lincoln coat and he's putting it on. And he then goes into this first anaphora in that speech, which is 100 years later. 100 years later, the Negro is still not free. 100 years later, we still have these problems. He goes on and on, 100 years later. That's his first great refrain. So he's not tying the civil rights movement to Brown versus Board of Ed or Rosa Parks. He's tying it to the American Civil War and the events that happened there. And then, because it is a masterpiece, he has another wonderful literary device. He introduces this metaphor of the promissory note. He says that we were given a promissory note of equal rights from the government. It's an IOU, essentially, a banknote. but we've tried to cash it and come back with insufficient funds. And he says, we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. And the reason I mention that is because this was a time of great change. There are different theories of history, but when things crystallize, when all of a sudden there's stasis for 50 years of Jim Crow, and then things change in a hurry. And that's kind of the moment that we're in today, or that we were in very recently. So, and these moments of change have as much to do with the recent history, Little Rock 9, the March in Birmingham, as they do with the Civil War, the American Revolution, our ideas, constitutional values. Some photos you're probably very well aware with living in Richmond, but a few years ago in the summer of 2020, and I do think that 2020, there's some years, 1968, 1929, 1917, it just kind of, things happen. I think 2020 is going to be one of those that we remember in the society. But in the summer, protests started looking at Confederate memorialization all across the country. And I think that happened in part because a lot of the issues in our society that the George Floyd death and others brought about are very long-term issues. They will take years to figure out, for housing equity and community policing relations and things like that. But a number of activists around the country found a protest that had been going on for a long time. It happened in the 90s, happened in the 70s. Carolyn Janey, actually, who's going to be one of the people next in February, her research shows it happening in the 1950s. Of people saying, why do we have U.S. Army assets that are named after Confederates? If there's one thing Confederates did without any doubt whatsoever, it's that they fought against U.S. Army soldiers and they killed them. They also died in the battles. I'm not trying to make this seem like a slaughter. But the United States Army, if you served in the United States Army in the Civil War, you served in the same army that George Washington served in and that Colin Powell served in, wherever you want to end it. That's been the same army for 248 years now. The Confederate Army existed for 4 years. And in fact, 4 of the Confederate generals whose names were on forts never served in the United States Army. They never had a day of Army service. I should rephrase. Leonidas Polk went to West Point, then he resigned immediately. So he had West Point service. And so in this, Congress saw this as something, they said, this is something we can do right away. It doesn't take a lot of time. And they did it that summer through the National Defense Authorization Act, the NDAA, everything government has an acronym. And the NDAA essentially is the bill every year that funds the Army. So if you were following the news, and because there's no line in veto, President Trump could veto the entire bill, and he actually did. It was this. There's also some issues about the internet privacy usage in there. But as a result, when he vetoed this, he not only vetoed the naming commission, he expressed his feelings in tweets. A number of Americans agreed with him on this. But he also vetoed better time off. He vetoed civilian benefits. And the congressional response was pretty clear. So in the course of 8 days, President Trump vetoed it right before Christmas. In the New Year's break, where there's virtually no news, this was a big news story. And even the Heritage Foundation said, why did he do this? We need a National Defense Authorization Act. And then Congress voted to override the veto, the first time, the only time in President Trump's presidency that Congress overrode the veto. And it's worth noting the override was 87-13 in the Senate and a similar majority in the House. And those that were not in the 87, those in the 13, were from both sides. So Bernie Sanders was in the 13, Tom Cotton was in the 13. It was people who had different ideological issues with parts of the bill also. I also want to point out, it's important to note that the January 1st date, this happened before the January 6th incidents at the Capitol. So this was not, as some people have thought, a rebuttal to President Trump or a rebuke of him in that sense. This happened just because Congress thought that this needed to happen to go forward. So that created the Naming Commission, which I was honored to serve. The commissioners themselves were 8 individuals who I lost count, but had at least over 2 centuries, probably more like 3 centuries of experience in Washington, in the military, in civil military relations. The Commandant of the Marine Corps, the chair of the History Department at West Point, the first African-American woman ever to be reached the rank of 4-star admiral, the head of the Corps of Engineers, a congressman from Georgia. These were not, ideologues. These were public servants with long history. And they took their job incredibly seriously. I already read the commission's charge to you, but it was to identify any issues of Confederate commemoration in the Department of Defense. Anything that the DoD owned was an asset. And then to make a plan for its modification or removal. And names, displays, symbols, monuments, paraphernalia. As a result of that, working with the Naming Commission, we found that, I can't make this up, the Excel spreadsheet had 1,111 lines of Confederate commemoration. So we got to stop there and find 2222. But we didn't actually have to. But that's what we found. And the structure is important to note. We were a congressional commission impaneled by Congress, but we were independent of all these entities. So I've tried to do what each side does. The words near the picture is what those people do, if that makes sense. So Congress mandated our work. They gave us our charge, and we reported to them, and 3 reports ultimately. We worked with the military. Our direct staff was 6, but our military support staff was easily 100 people. And it was incredibly humbling to have a Army major or an Army colonel helping me with my travel and making sure I got places safely. I was so grateful for their incredible support. We had a 2-star general dedicated just to helping us. That was their job full time. Now, we heard the military's thoughts, but we heard it. There was no requirement there. As a thought experiment, this did not happen. But if Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin had called me and said, "Connor, I demand you do this," I could have said, "Thank you for your opinion," and gone about my day. In return, and also this matters a lot, is that the Congress and the Pentagon continue the relationship they've always had. The military serves the people. Ever since George Washington returned control of the military, gave his sword to Congress, this has been a civilian-run military, which is not the case everywhere in the world, and something we should be very, I think, proud of as Americans. So we, for a year and a half, went all over, I'd say the country, but really all over the South, because the majority of these assets were in the South, including the 9 bases that we named. I like this picture of the Major General Timothy Williams and myself, no relation, though we have the same last name. That's actually taken right up the hill from here at the Virginia War Memorial. And so we're having actually a very good conversation, but it looks like a very passionate one. We reported to Congress. We briefed them through Zoom every month, and we went to the Hill twice to report out. And then we wrote these 3 reports that dealt with all 1,111 assets that we identified. And what we found briefly, very quickly, is that there was a lot of discussion about people, often things like, why are you erasing history? Why are you taking away, my great-grandfather was an honorable man, why are you taking away his honor? And a lot of these questions, and they were real questions. They were questions not asked with anger, not asked with frustration, well, something with frustration, but certainly not with hatred or anything the news would have us think about. They were asked just by people who were trying to figure out what was going on. And so I thought about these for a long time, and I did a lot of reading in historical scholarship and philosophy. And what we came up with ultimately was a pretty substantial difference between memory, history, and commemoration. And memory, we need all 3. Memory, there are some birds that can fly from the same island or the same tree in Newfoundland all the way down to the same island off Patagonia and back every year, and they have that kind of memory. But as far as we know, we're the only species that has a memory that we can communicate to others, we can pass down. It's how we remember how to change a snow tire and, do a kidney replacement and all the impressive things that we can do as humans. So we need a memory. But our memory sometimes does too much for us. And At Gettysburg, this is the annual Gettysburg reenactment of what the war was like. And getting aside kind of the humorous parts of the portalettes and the ambulance and the iPhone cameras and all that, there's a slight danger to over-romanticizing our Civil War, to finding too much, pomp and prestige in it, because the reality of the war is far more grim. And I meet a lot of Civil War reenactors. I'm glad they do it. It's a great public service. I'm not trying to disparage my allies in this work, but you kind of meet hardcore reenactors sometimes who say, I only eat out of a metal cup, or I lock my phone in my glove box when I go and reenact. And I always say that's great, but if you really want to reenact the Civil War, you have to be about 16, eat 800 calories a day for 3 weeks, have no food, and no vaccinations. And that gets you somewhat closer to the Civil War as it actually unfolded. At the same time, history cannot do everything for us. History, as a kind of a very grim thought experiment, and to depart from the Civil War for a second, if you're trying to do the history of the Holocaust, and you did a PowerPoint presentation, and you just flashed an image every second of a Jewish person or a Roma person, someone murdered in the Holocaust. That's all it did. 1, 2, 3, 4. We would be in this room for 69 and a half days, nonstop, to do that. And I guarantee you, I don't mean this in a flippant way, we would all go insane before we got to the end of that time. So we need some way to make sense of this. That's why things at Auschwitz, like the shaving kits and the shoes, are so powerful. They give us a sense to understand what this is like. One more note on reenacting. It's a very uniquely American thing. Everybody should go to Barcelona if they can, but you will never see on a Sunday morning in Barcelona a bunch of nationalists and a bunch of fascists and Republicans all getting their machine guns out and reenacting the Battle for Barcelona in 1936 and Spanish Civil War. You won't see it. They don't understand why we do this in this country. And then there's commemoration. And commemoration is what we really were dealing with. That's what the word Congress used. But commemoration is what parts of our history we decide to exalt for our present and for our future. And I wrote about this a little bit, so rather than try to speak off the cuff, I'll just cite a source. But what we came with, ultimately, was the following. Although Americans owe much of their modern identity to the Civil War, they do not owe commemoration equally to both sides. Though often conflated, commemoration and history come from all sections of our society and serve different purposes for different people. History describes the people and places of the past in all their greatness and grimness, achievements and failures, nobility and notoriety. But commemoration elevates an act, event, or individual by bestowing it with communal esteem and honor. The best histories present humans and their choices in the context of their complex and complicated days they lived through, articulating those decisions and actions to inform us on the societies of our past. The best commemorations highlight individuals, movements, and moments that epitomize the highest values of our present and motivate us as we shape our societies of the future. So one is about fact, one is about inspiration. One's about what happened, the other is about what could happen. History recounts, explains, and examines. Commemoration celebrates, affirms, and extols. History is about who we were. Commemoration is about who we strive to be. And that's what I think this discussion we've really been having is about. I, in no way, want to besmirch, or I'm a millennial, and for a while we could cause all the world's problems, and now it's Gen Z's fault, so that's good. But the last thing I want to do is find some poor kid who's 17 and signs up because his father makes him, or everybody else in this town is doing it. And then that's 61. 62, the Confederate government extends all enlistments for life, so he's in it till the war's over. And he's in Petersburg somehow, and he's got no food, and he's got no shoes, and the last thing I want to do is go back and try to kick dirt on his suffering. That's in some sense doing what some Americans, North and South, did to African Americans in the 19th century. It removes their humanity. I don't want to do that. But in terms of what stories from our past we want to celebrate the most in our future, the commissioners decided, listening to lots of Americans, which I can talk to a bit more in the Q&A, that the stories on the right were ultimately a lot more powerful than the stories on the left. I love talking about this. I could talk for a very long time, but I'm going to speak to Dr. Havers and then open up for questions. So, thank you.
And now our president and CEO, Dr. Rob Havers, is going to engage Mr. Williams in conversation, and then it'll be your chance out there to ask some questions.
A very good evening to you all. As you heard, my name is Rob Havers, President and CEO of the American Civil War Museum. We endeavor to provide an exposition of the American Civil War. As you heard from Kelly, its causes, its course, and its consequences. And this evening, we are looking at some of the consequences of the American Civil War. For the retired artillery men or women in the audience, Connor Williams, present here tonight, is a target of opportunity. He came down to look around Richmond. I had a Zoom call with him and asked him to come and talk about this legacy of the Civil War that is with us today. So we're delighted to have you here this evening, Connor. And it's a timely discussion. As you most likely saw today in the newspaper, the Hunter Holmes McGuire VA Medical Center right here in Richmond has also been renamed and henceforth will be known as the Richmond VA Medical Center. So a very apposite moment, Connor, for you to be here with us today. I'm curious, first of all, and we will have a few questions from me and we'll open it up. I know a lot of you have a lot of interesting questions you want to pose to Connor. But Connor, I'm curious, your personal interest in the Civil War, where did that come from? What piqued your interest in the Civil War?
Thank you. I'm just going to try to project, I think, my mic. Thank you for the great question. It happened in some ways many similar to the way that Robert Penn Warren and Bruce Catton got their interest through talking with an elderly person. And in that case, it was my grandfather. He was a career military officer, but he was born in 1913. And as a young historian, I used to grill him. And I wanted to know about World War I. I think he got kind of frustrated with me because he was 5 when it ended. He eventually said one day, he said, Connor, when I was your age, I knew Civil War veterans. And I knew formerly enslaved people. They were my neighbors. They came to my school for Lincoln Day. He was Massachusetts. And they were my greatest generation. They were my icons. And he was born in 1913, 50 years after Gettysburg. He lived long enough to vote for Barack Obama. He could have voted against Barack Obama. That's fine with me. But the main thing is he saw in his lifetime that change. And so to me as a historian, that just got me maybe understand the Civil War it's not far in the past. For those in the 20th century, it was their last great war. And it was what they understood their country to come from. And so in some ways, it's trying to carry on not just his legacy, but that entire generation. If you know anybody who was born in 1920, knew anybody who was born in 1920, that person knew men who had fought on both sides, people who had been enslaved, outside this course, but Native Americans who'd grown up on the plains. So that's really what got me interested in it. Thank you for the question.
Well, very interesting, and it is fascinating. That's 3 generations removed, essentially.
Yeah.
To touch the Civil War.
2 handshakes.
Yeah, exactly. The thrust of the Naming Commission obviously centers on 9 U.S. military establishments named for Confederate leaders. Why were these 9 installations named for Confederates originally?
It's a great question. Essentially, it happened, not essentially, absolutely, it happened during World War I and World War II. And in fact, prior to that, the U.S. Army's policy was very much anti-Confederate. Most famously, George Washington Cullom of West Point, who he with his father was there from 1828 all the way to 1903. They were one of these West Point families. He did the first history of West Point, and when he bequeathed his legacy to Cullom Hall, which is still where it's the West Point War Memorial, it's a sacred ground. His original bequeath said that no Confederate name was ever to be spoken in that building, and that was done in 1898. But what happens in World War I and then again World War II, you have a massive mobilization. 5 million men World War I, 15 million men World War II mobilized more or less overnight. And you have to build training camps. And those camps need three things. They need lots of flat, not freezing cold land that's abundant and plentiful and cheap. They need rail line proximity, and they need it to be able to train year round because they're not really doing the now condition quite yet. And so that's in the South. Plus, you have Southern Democrats, Woodrow Wilson, and then FDR, Southern Democratic Party has a lot of power, gets these bases in their communities. The very quick naming conventions that they create are two. One, that the name not be offensive to the local community. That's the Army language. And the other one that I think is kind of more, in a way, funny Army style is that they want it very short because they're going to be spray painting onto all these crates of ammunition. They're going to be putting these names. And so they don't want Kirby Smith, Lee, Hood, Bragg. So that's how they're named. Essentially, in each case, the Army historians, they're thinking about winning the war. They're not thinking about the names too much. They say, okay, we're in Virginia. Who's from Virginia? Who do the local folks like? And Robert E. Lee, A.P. Hill, George Pickett. That's how they get named. And in some cases, they go for Fort Benning, Henry Benning, who never served the United States Army at all. They literally went to the UDC, the United States Confederacy, and said, who should name this fort after? And now they came back with
That's what that says to me.
So that's what they got named. Equal parts kind of politics, geography, and local history. And in some ways, a big departure from tradition to that point.
Very interesting. Fascinating array of very worthy individuals for whom the new bases are named. Hal Moore is up there, wholly appropriate, as are the others. I'm curious about the considerations that drove the Commission's decisions to name these bases. How did these people get chosen, especially perhaps Dr. Mary Walker? That's an interesting choice.
Absolutely. And I'm going to actually, I think, use my clicker. So we had a pretty clear process, and what was very clear to us beforehand was, and one of the great, I think, achievements of the Naming Commission, if you want to think of it that way, is we started this with 87 senators supporting us, and we ended it with 87 senators supporting us, more or less. Some people changed, had re-elections, et cetera. But there were chances for Congress throughout this to say, we don't like what you're doing, change it, and they didn't. There was a bipartisan beginning, middle, and end to this story. Part of that, I think, is because we really listened to people. We went to all of these forts, and we met with their officers, with their enlisted soldiers. We had listening sessions where we just listened. Unless we had to clarify a question, all we did was listen. And we met with the communities around these posts, people whose businesses, the Fort Bragg laundromat, or things like that. We spoke with political leaders and heard their opinions. And we got letters from people, literally handwritten letters. It was very touching to get handwritten letters. In some cases saying my great-great-grandfather served in the Mexican-American War and probably not a chance, but maybe you could think about him. And we also had a website where anybody could submit. There were a few kind of joke submissions, but by and large, the website submissions were very serious too. So from that, we got 35,000 recommendations, and we whittled that down to 3,500 unique names, because some people spelled MacArthur with an A, and some people didn't.
I think he's already answered this question.
Discussion. We then looked at that, we got into 450 meritorious candidates, essentially saying these people really have the military credit to have a fort be named after them. And then with a big team of historians, the Army has so many historians, it's kind of hidden from view sometimes, which is a shame because they're wonderful historians, they do great work. But we worked down to 87 candidates, kind of a short list, and presented those to the commissioners. They added a few names, took away a few names, and they decided. But what I'm really glad to say is that every one of these names we chose had, if you think about these 6 groups, they had at least 4 or 5 of them behind them. And they all almost had relevance to the area. So Hal Moore and Julia Moore, because it's named for both of them. It's named for the Moore family, the military family. If you know about the 7th Cavalry in the Yadrang Valley in Vietnam, it's what the Mel Gibson movie We Were Soldiers is kind of based off of. Not kind of, it is based off that. They trained at Fort Benning, shipped out from Fort Benning, and Fort Benning is where Julia Moore accompanied the telegrams of notifying people of death or woundings, spouses of their husbands being killed or wounded in Vietnam. Fort Hood, named after John Bell Hood, who was a Texan or a Kentuckian, but when his state didn't leave the Union, he then decided he was a Texan and he joined them. We renamed with Richard Cavazos, who's a Texan through and through, born on the King Ranch, this ranch the size of Rhode Island, goes to Texas Tech, ROTC, serves at Fort Hood. So he's a Texas story, and we tried to do those things as well. Mary Walker, we got a lot of enthusiasm from the Fort A.P. Hill community to name it after her. The only connection she really has to the area, to be honest, is she was imprisoned here in Richmond for 4 months. Mary Walker was the first woman to be a surgeon in the U.S. Army, the only woman to ever receive the Medal of Honor. And in the Yadrang Valley in Vietnam, it's what the Mel Gibson movie We Were Soldiers is kind of based off of. Not kind of, it is based off that. They trained at Fort Benning, shipped out from Fort Benning, and Fort Benning is where Julia Moore accompanied the telegrams of notifying people of death or woundings, spouses of their husbands being killed or wounded in Vietnam. Fort Hood, named after John Bell Hood, who was a Texan or a Kentuckian, but when his state didn't leave the Union, he then decided he was a Texan and he joined them. We renamed with Richard Cavazos, who's a Texan through and through, born on the King Ranch, this ranch the size of Rhode Island, goes to Texas Tech, ROTC, serves at Fort Hood. So he's a Texas story, and we tried to do those things as well. Mary Walker, we got a lot of enthusiasm from the Fort A.P. Hill community to name it after her. The only connection she really has to the area, to be honest, is she was imprisoned here in Richmond for 4 months. Mary Walker was the first woman to be a surgeon in the U.S. Army, the only woman to ever receive the Medal of Honor, and a suffragette, a women's rights activist. She wore men's clothes for a lot of her later life, and when she got arrested, she said 2 things. She wore her medal and she pointed it to it. She said, I earned the right to do whatever I want in this country. And she also said, I don't wear men's clothes, I wear my clothes. And that was a key moment. Fort A.P. Hill really liked her story. They're a place where men train for combat. They have National Guard units that come there and they rent it out for the weekend and they do their maneuvers. And they thought having a Army civilian, a healer, a doctor was something they really wanted to get behind. And when we heard that, the last thing I wanted to do was disagree, and I don't. So, yeah.
Thank you, Connor. I'm going to turn it over to our audience. I know we've got a lot of questions. Connor, I'm going to let you moderate. Pick the friendliest faces if you like, and I can jump in if things get nasty.
Absolutely.
So,
and what I might try is just to get, if there are lots of questions, we'll see. But I might call on 2 people, and we'll hear both your questions, and I'll try to synthesize answers. But in the front row, yes.
I have a question.
Sure.
First, thank you for coming. My name's Jack Shula. I live in Lynchburg, Virginia.
Okay.
It's a beautiful facility here. Went through the museum.
Thank you.
First question is, in reading the Commission's 3rd report, it seems that the Arlington National Cemetery Confederate Monument meets the Commission's definition of a grave marker. Were you involved in that discussion? And if so, can you explain the rationale of including the monument in the recommendations, notwithstanding congressional direction to exclude grave markers from the report? And I also have a statement when you said earlier about naming these bases during the early part of the, 20th century, when they were going around trying to, get people trained for the military. It seemed like you used the word political. So it was a political advantage, I guess, to name these bases after Confederate generals and so on. And now, I guess it's a political advantage to remove the names. So I guess it's sort of a political stunt in my view.
Do you want to get one more question, then I'll try to.
Were you going to answer the question about the
absolutely.
grave marker?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I want to get people's voices heard if possible. So, yes, sir. Green vest.
I'd actually like to address the same issue of the statue in Arlington.
Yeah. Okay.
That was one of the things that modern historians eliminate from their memory is the reconciliation period that was going on at the turn of the century as the South was trying to prove that they were good Americans and the North greeted them with open arms. One of the things that was material at that time was that national cemeteries only had Union soldiers. And President McKinley, a Union veteran, led the move to open the national cemeteries to Confederate veterans. President Taft funded it. President Wilson was the one who accepted the monument. President Taft chose the artist, native of Richmond, Moses Ezekiel. He was the most famous sculptor in the world at the time. He had just finished the Columbus statue for the Columbian Exposition in Chicago and is buried beneath it. President Wilson accepted it on behalf of the people of the United States. I don't for the life of me understand why a grave marker gets removed. And when I inquired of our Senator Kane, who's on the Armed Forces Committee, his response is because of its depiction of African Americans. And I said to myself, if it had simply been an obelisk, it probably would not have been removed. And if that is the case, aren't you just censoring art?
Thank you very much for both questions, and they are, I think, very similar veins. So I'll try to speak to them in combination. This is what the two gentlemen are speaking about. This is the Moses Ezekiel monument in Arlington National Cemetery. Confederates have their own burial section in Arlington National Cemetery. The graves are actually outlined in the Confederate cross, which is different than the cross on United States graves. It's the equal-sided. So where to begin? For the first part, just briefly, the base names, there was a political advantage to getting them located in your area, because if you're a congressman from Fayetteville and you're going to get an army base there, it's going to bring all these soldiers who have furlough and money to spend. They're still economic drivers in the community. So that's why there's a political advantage. The names then are what the Army did kind of in its own sense. So the commissioners looked at this. This is a monument surrounded by grave markers. And the first thing I'm very glad to say, working with Arlington National Cemetery, they got a very expensive report done to make sure that this could be removed without disturbing any actual grave markers. Because as you pointed out, Moses Ezekiel is buried, one of four, right at the base of it. And so with engineers and all kinds of folks, they know they can do this without disturbing any grave markers, which is an important part of this. Senator Kane, what he's referring to is there's a picture on this of a Confederate soldier kissing his child behind, who's being held by a tearful enslaved woman who fits the mammy description essentially to a T, which many people find offensive and untrue to the experience of the enslaved people. But ultimately, this is something where the law is very clear. If it's a monument that commemorates the Confederacy, then indeed it has to go. We didn't have a say in that. I think it's pretty safe to say that that's Lady Confederacy. They have the 13 shields of the Confederate States, even though there are actually only 11 Confederate states. They added Kentucky and Missouri because they kind of had, and they actually added Maryland, which never joined the Confederacy or even claimed to. There is this, it's a UDC monument, not a grave marker. It's a monument to our dead heroes, but every person has their own grave marker around it. And what you can't quite read down here is there's a Latin phrase, and I'll translate it roughly to the victorious cause was pleasing to the gods, but the lost cause was pleasing to Cato. And that comes from a Latin expression. Cato is the Roman statesman who, when the Republic was becoming a empire, chose execution rather than to submit, and they botched his execution, so he actually pulled his own entrails out to finish the job, as myth has it. And what that expression means is that the Confederacy will always be right, will always be noble, and the victorious cause will always be wrong. That's essentially the easiest way to explain that. And so that commemorates the Confederacy. And our job was not to say, is it pretty? It was not to say, is it awe-inspiring? It was to say, does it commemorate the Confederacy? And we thought it did, so our really only choice was to recommend it be removed. I'd have to be happy to talk more about this, but by Arlington Cemetery's own historical judgment, they said it's not a grave marker. It's not a grave marker any more than the Gettysburg monuments are grave markers. They're not. They're there to commemorate the unit who fought there. I appreciate the signs. Yep, sure.
My name is Robin Williams.
Yes.
Thank you so much for being here. You're a very entertaining speaker, and I'm sure your classes are filled to the brim. And thank you to the museum for holding this event. It seems to me this monument could be interpreted, and the historic record would support this interpretation, of a significant moment in the evolution of the country following the war, of reconciliation and reunification. It grew out of the strong support from Southern men in the U.S. Army for the Spanish-American War, signifying, yes, we are all one brotherhood defending our country. And the dedication event was attended by veterans of both the North and the South who were shaking hands. There was this whole sense of reconciliation. And it seems to me, you refer in the report to, commemorating noble values. And that was a very important, significant point, again, in the evolution of the country, that everybody recognized at last that we were reconciled. All the problems aren't solved. There's still lots of work to do. But it was, I think a lot of people interpret this monument as a positive symbol of that important moment in our history. And it seems to me to destroy an important historical and cultural work of art puts us in the same league with the Taliban and ISIS.
It's a great question. I do have my 2-question policy. So any other question, or I can speak to?
Because I have lived in Richmond for a few years now before the monuments were taken down, and one of the biggest issues that I found was lack of information. We don't know, walking by them, when they were built, who built them. So I'm just wondering if that was, ever a part of the conversation, like having, the names of these military bases, have more information available to the public, or for the monuments, just so we know exactly what these items or locations are that we are looking at, because that seemed to be something that wasn't always apparent.
Yeah. Yeah, it's great. To your immediate question, the Southern Poverty Law Center has a large website that deals with all these monuments and where they are. And it's not perfect, some of their algorithms. I looked up, there's a Forest Lane near my parents' house, and I was like, wait, it's in Albany, New York. Why is there it's named after a forest, like trees, not Nathan Bedford Forest. But a lot of it is right, spot on. To reconciliation, I think that the biggest question that a lot of folks would ask is, who is being left out in the reconciliation story. And the question is, at first, 8 and then 10 and then 12 million African Americans. The reconciliation that happens after the Civil War is a white reconciliation, and it's intentionally at the expense of African Americans. No African Americans are present at the Gettysburg reunion except for as cooks. And actually, I should, because Carrie Janey, who's going to be here, she did some research. They had a very small monument, but a small presence, but they were not invited to join the white veterans. They reconciled. And the reconciliation also, I think there's two sides of it. The one reality is the South, the Confederacy, didn't really have a choice but to reconcile. I think we often kind of see reconciliation as a brave step taken by former Confederates. They lost the war. They surrendered their arms. Their two choices were to live forever a part of the United States or to reconcile. For the United States, reconciliation, in fact, is proving what you're fighting for, which is not for everybody. It wasn't to end slavery. That was a byproduct of the war. I'm very glad it happened. But what you're fighting for is to preserve the United States. And there's no better way to prove you can preserve the United States than to say you're back in the United States. And I think if you look at veterans reunions, there's still a lot of hard feeling. There's never the photos that Ken Burns makes so much good of are really, in a sense, the exception rather than the rule. So I think that's kind of the reconciliation. I don't deny it happened, but it also was pretty clearly at the expense of a large group of Americans. And again, I think that there's no thing. I encourage us all to have our own memories of the war. I will say that I'm so glad to be here for many reasons, for the great questions, for the conversation, also just to be next to what I really firmly believe is the single greatest Civil War museum in the country, and I've been to a lot of them. It tells the story so well and so powerfully and makes it a bitter, remorseless, revolutionary struggle, as Lincoln called it. So I do think that it's important to remember the war. Lastly, there's destroying. This has not been destroyed. It has been stored, and the Army has been told to find a place for it or to store it as cheaply as possible. But it has not been melted down yet that I'm aware of. This was a unanimous decision by the commissioners. Yes.
Also, thank you for coming. I think it's really wrong how there is an arrogant defining of the war from the South as if they all hated a race of people and they died to subjugate it. When we left Britain and formed the United States, each state was its own country. It had its own flag, it had its own money, faith, tradition. There were 13 different ones. And even Eisenhower, when he talked about Robert E. Lee, he said this decision to leave, we weren't an empire yet. And so when Lincoln called up 75,000 troops to come over the Potomac River to the museum to George Washington, which was Arlington, and people were in, they had guns, that was an invasion. And the right of secession was understood by every state, and it was hammered out, and Virginia, Rhode Island, and New York would not have joined in this thing called the United States if they didn't have the right to secede when one section of the country was abusing the other. So this was a money war. There were many people. A.P. Hill didn't approve of slavery. Jackson didn't. He had a black Sunday school. There was so much love in the South, and I believe it's the love that you see on the drum there in those 32 figures by Ezekiel between the races that is really not acknowledged, and I think it's cosmically wrong to attribute a different cause for why they fought, that it was for slavery. If Lincoln was fighting to free the slaves, why did his Emancipation Proclamation say slavery was fine as long as one was loyal to the government? Lincoln said he was not. I know, he was not fighting to free slaves. So is Honest Abe a liar? you know, it's still
I
very.
would like to answer some of these. I do have the.
We'd love to hear your answers.
Okay.
It's wrong to tell people died. Fathers in the SPLC has this chart that says, oh, all these monuments went up in the South. Oh, it's Jim Crow. Well, these people didn't have two nickels to rub together to honor their fathers and their uncles and their grandfathers who fought. So these were funerary.
Sue, we are running out of time, but you set your 2 question standard. So we've obviously got a bit of a movement in here. If you can respond briefly to this, we can discuss, and then we will end with Emily, your final question.
Absolutely. To the a lot of work that there's sometimes you don't want to redo work that's been done better already. So Ed Ayers did a wonderful teaching seminar where he uses the scholarship of the University of Richmond to show the causes and course of the American Civil War. And I would really direct you to that.
I know what he's done.
Okay, then he addresses a lot of your questions there. The fact that 1 out of 4 Southern people owned slaves does not mean that 3 out of 4 were deeply invested in slavery and white supremacy. They were hiring enslaved people to work on their farms. It was a mud cell for them, which they said in all their speeches.
You can say words don't mean it's true.
Well, I think the question I would have is for all the love in the South that we saw, as soon as the United States Army came through, enslaved people, 1 million of them, risked their lives to get to U.S. Army lines.
Yeah, and then 1 million of them died during Reconstruction. 1 million, 1/4 of all the freed slaves died under the United States flag, not the Confederate flag.
Yeah.
1 million died under the United States flag.
I would like to hear your sources on that, but
No, I'll send you my sources.
the people who are shooting them and murdering them in New Orleans are people who fought for freedom.
And they couldn't move to Ohio because Ohio wouldn't allow blacks to live there or move there. The great Union, Ohio.
This is
There's so much. There's so much on both sides. We just want balance and truth.
I would point you to the
Point
what
to
Professor
what?
Ayers has said about this and many other scholars. There was a lot there. Secession, a right. Was it maybe a right? Yes. It's the first thing the Confederates do in their new Constitution, outline further secession. Yes. So that's a strange double.
Is it still talked about today? Yes.
It is. Also, as you're absolutely right, that I will be very upfront. Anybody, I don't think I said anything in this talk. The phenomenon of the treasury of virtue in the North, that we were somehow a noble people, and all the North has a horrible problem of putting all its sins on the South. You go anywhere in the Northern United States, find racism, bigotry, violence. That's absolutely true. I will stand by the fact that we have stories of thousands of enslaved people who escaped to freedom every chance they got. I'm not sure where the Dellman statements were. We have the story of exactly one person who was free and returned to enslavement, and he did that to be with his family because he thought it was better to be close to his blood.
So let's move to Professor Raymond for a final question.
Thank you. Thanks for coming. And I have 2 questions. One is just how much the whole commission cost to do this for 2 years. And then second is about you said that it was to rename anything that had anything to do with the Confederacy, right? So there were the military bases named after Confederate leaders, and those names were changed. But were there other, you mentioned cocktail napkins and conference rooms, were those named after Confederate leaders, or were they named after people who were famous for other reasons and just happened to be in the Confederacy? And I asked that question because VCU did a very similar thing. Confederacy, compared to their whole life story. So I was wondering if you ran across that problem or that issue with the non-military base renaming issues.
No, all wonderful questions, and a great chance to reiterate that I understand. I'm happy to have these conversations. Congress wrote a law telling us to do this, so we would have been in dereliction of our duty had we not said that when I think this commemorates the Confederacy, any item, any asset, anybody who voluntarily served. So the things that were, there were displays, Confederate pistols on display, paintings of Confederates doing noble things in moonlight by rivers and with horses, and those were all there. At AP Hill in the 1950s, one post-historian got really excited about AP Hill, and he found everybody who had served on AP Hill's staff, he found AP Hill's horses, he found AP Hill's kids, and he named a street after each of those people. So there's not only AP Hill, but his entire AP Hill staff is on there, and most of them are Confederates. So I think one example would be Lake Lanier, which is in Georgia and a very popular vacation destination. After Sidney Lanier, who's a poet of, honestly, his poetry doesn't really inspire me, but I'm not to say it's not fine poetry in terms of meter and verse. He was a Confederate. He afterwards became a poet associated with the South, and Lake Lanier is run by the Army Corps of Engineers. It's dammed up the river to make the lake. In that case, the commission said, we're looking at Department of Defense assets. This is something that is created by something the Army is doing, but it's not really a defense asset. And so they thought that Lake Lanier could remain as it was. Ultimately, I think what's safe to say is that for all of these individuals, and I'd be happy to talk more after this, the Confederacy is what defined their life. You got Henry Benning, John Gordon, Polk, and Rucker never served in the United States Army. They returned $1.5 million to the American taxpayer, which we were proud to do. The cost of swinging every hammer and hiring to repaint every water tower, and actually the back end is interesting because there's a whole cyber aspect to this also, where you have to change these names on mainframes and servers. That will cost about $50 million, which, boy, I would love to have that in not just my bank account, but my town's bank account or anyone's bank account. It does bear repeating that the military every year gets $4 billion of essentially pocket money to spend on anything, which this can easily cover. So it's not, your taxes are not going up because of this, and I can guarantee that also.
So on that note, and Colin's going to remain behind probably for quite some time to address some of these questions. What I would say is, Colin Williams, thank you for coming down here. We had some seriously well thought out questions from a great audience. Very much appreciate that. As you can see, the Civil War is alive and well in many ways. The American Civil War Museum, as I said, does our best to look at the origins, what happened, and the contemporary implications with which we live every day. So this is a big element of that. So thank you for coming. We've got some great programs lined up, as Kelly Hancock alluded to, beginning with the symposium, 18th of February, Carrie Janey, and a star array of Civil War historians. If you are a member of the museum, thank you for your support. Our ability to put on programs like this is in large part down to that support. If you're not a member and are inspired by what you've heard here today, the debate, the questions, consider becoming a member. We cannot do everything we do without your support. So thank you for coming. Conrad, I think you have one more word to say.
Not to go other institutions, but I will be giving a similar talk to this one at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture in the middle of March 16th. It is March 16th. That's at the end of the day. It's at noon, but I would love to tonight and also keep these discussions going. We may not agree on everything. That's probably likely, but it's important to have conversations and compare opinions and compare thoughts. So I really do want to have this, keep going here and there. So, and thank you.
Thank you.